Our next guest is an award-winning journalist, a documentary filmmaker, and a broadcaster who hosts a program called The Breach for Rewire Media. She is also the creator of a new film entitled Care in Chaos. It's an original documentary for Rewire, and I haven't talked to her in ages, so I'm happy to be in touch with her again. Lindsay Beyerstein, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And so tell us a little bit, if you would, about Care in Chaos.
Sure. Care in Chaos is a documentary about two red state abortion clinics, both with very active, raucous protester presences. And the difference between them, one, the rule of law prevails, and one where it really doesn't. And what we set out to understand is what makes the difference between those two places. In Fargo, North Dakota, they've got protesters lining the sidewalk, but nobody's blocking anything, nobody's threatening anybody, life just goes on. Whereas in Charlotte, North Carolina, you've got protesters who are besieging this clinic in the Preferred Women's Health Clinic every day, bombarding the place with amplified sound, blocking the sidewalk, violating all kinds of laws and ordinances, and the police basically can't or won't do anything about it.
Yeah, and
I want to stress that I'm not saying that the police should prevent people from protesting. We believe in, I'm pretty much an absolutist about First Amendment rights, but it's important to me that other laws are also enforced at the same time and people's safety is looked after in terms of the road and stuff like that.
Well, people's safety in terms of the road, people's safety in terms of feeling safe and unharassed physically. I mean, one of the things I thought of in looking at the film and listening to you talking about it now is, I was reminded of the fact that the United States military used the bombardment of loud music and sound against Manuel Noriega in Panama, for example. That to really assault people orally, physically, crowd them, make them feel unsafe, uncomfortable, is, I also am a First Amendment absolutist, but I guess let's start there before we go into the issue of reproductive care. Where do you think the line should be drawn?
Well, I think that basically the First Amendment is very expansive in terms of the content of your speech, your ability to say what you want, but there's also a long tradition of time, place, and manner restrictions on freedom of speech. So, for instance, you can say whatever you want as long as you're not advocating imminent violence, but you can't necessarily say it over a microphone at all hours of the day. And even Charlotte, North Carolina actually has a noise ordinance that says you can only broadcast at such and such a decibel level at certain times a day. And I think that's perfectly reasonable because you do have to balance the logistics of living in a city and organizing a community, as well as people's right to say their piece. It doesn't mean that they can say it absolutely anywhere at any volume. And then there are just all kinds of other laws that have to be enforced whether you're expressing your free speech or not, like you can't block a public sidewalk, you can't stand in the road, you can't stick your hands through open windows of people's cars without their permission. These are all things that are just regular laws, a part of having a civilization that shouldn't be ignored just because somebody is expressing their genuine right to free speech.
And how often do you think in the case where people aren't really being given the space and so on that they should, not in Fargo but in North Carolina, how often do you think, for example, that women give up and go home?
We saw one woman give up. She sort of circled around and then got bogged down in a group of protesters. You can see that exchange in the movie, actually. And then she drove off. I would say that that's the escort said that wasn't an uncommon thing. They basically, most shifts, I think they get everybody into the building, but every so often they'll lose somebody. And it's really a dire thing, a sad thing when that happens, because a lot of the time the cost to get an abortion goes up. So they're a busy clinic, and if somebody misses their appointment, then that might have repercussions for when she can get in to be seen again, and possibly the cost of a procedure or the window in which she can have a particular type of procedure or have a procedure at all. And also, it's really hard on the clinic because they run on a pretty narrow margin. So every appointment that they miss it costs them financially and impacts their ability to stay in business.
Which may, of course, be one of the protesters, and I hate to just call them protesters because it's more than that we're discussing here. It may be part of their motives. And again, Lindsay Beyerstein is the co-director of the Rewire documentary Caring Chaos, and we should give a shout out to Martina Starosta, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. You are co-director on this. So you talk here, you mentioned earlier, Lindsay, the question of, or what you said, I think, was the police in North Carolina can't or won't prevent this from getting what I would characterize as out of hand. Any sense on whether it is that they can't or that they won't?
It's some of both. I mean, there's a sort of structure, actually a literal physical geographic problem in terms of enforcing the noise ordinance, because the law says that you can't be broadcasting higher than 75 decibels, but it's very difficult for them when they're rolling up in their police car to get an unobserved reading. And we see that also in the film, where it's clear that they are blasting. You know, our cameras are rolling, we can hear it, but then by the time the police car rolls up, they can always see when the police car is coming. Right. So they just turn it down. And one of the cops on the scene, when we asked him about it, said, that's what happens every time. Of course they turn it down when we roll up. And they could have a plainclothes officer there, but the department has chosen not to do that because they feel that it's not conducive to their positive relationship with the community. So in that particular case, it's very much, it's sort of a combination of can't and won't. They won't take it to the next level, though they know it's a huge problem.
I wonder what would happen. I have an app on my phone that measures decibels, and I wonder what would happen if somebody there, you know, somebody who, you mentioned Calla Hales, I think is her name, the administrator of that clinic. I wonder if she or somebody just recorded it, and whether that could be, I don't know, now I'm getting too enmeshed, I guess, but whether that could be admitted as evidence.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because they do have volunteers with decibel readers on their phone, but for bureaucratic reasons, they say that that's not admissible. So that's another sort of example of won't, that they haven't written the law so as to make it practical for people to document these violations that are going on.
I always wonder too, Lindsay Beyerstein, about the people like Calla Hales, the people who work in these clinics, you know, or for that matter, the people who work in Fargo. I just think that it can be, maybe I'm just too sensitive for my own line of work, but I get kind of, it's stressful for me sometimes, taxing, I don't know exactly the right word, to be the subject of hate or vitriol. And this is just, you know, online. I mean, I would think to experience it on a daily basis would be very wearing, very stressful, and very demoralizing. Did you get any exposure to that at all?
I did. I mean, Calla Hales is one of the toughest people I've ever met. I have so much admiration for what she does, getting up every day and just doing this work. And it's, I mean, I would say that it seems like dealing with the protesters is a third of what she does, but she's not just the protester wrangler. She's the administrator of a chain of clinics. So she's administrating these, you know, several very busy businesses while she's dealing with this onslaught of hate and fear. I mean, some of these people have said some really horrible things to her that have led her to really fear for her personal safety. And as we explore in the movie, she was attacked by someone who turned out to have been a protester. He presented himself as a feminist and someone who was interested in her romantically, and she later discovered that he was linked to anti-choice forces. So it's just an incredible burden to just live under day after day.
Yeah, I would think so. And let's, and I am always, of course, concerned about the physical safety of people who work at these, you know, at these institutions and these clinics. Let's kind of pan back to director talk, you know. Let's pan back from these two clinics to the national situation as it stands now. I mean, obviously we've got Republicans controlling 2/3 of state houses, 2/3 of governorships, all three branches of the federal government. We have a kind of resurgence of the cultural right, if you will. What, if any, lessons can we draw from these two clinics that might help us navigate the next several years as far as reproductive rights, nationally speaking?
Well, one thing is that relationships between the clinic and the local police make all the difference. That Fargo wasn't always this oasis of support for reproductive rights as far as the clinic was concerned. They used to have a really rowdy protester problem, and their local police chief was just interested in community policing and help. And so Tammy, the woman who runs the clinic, reached out to him, and they started having a dialogue and were able to get policies changed and relationships built so that they were getting proper service and attention from the police department. And I think that that's not always possible. I mean, Cala has certainly moved heaven and earth to try and create a better dialogue with the Charlotte Police Department, and maybe it's coming along a little bit, but so it's not always possible. But where it is possible, it may not be political. I interviewed a lot of clinic owners and staffers around the country to try and figure out which site we were going to film at, and a lot of them told me, oh, yes, we do have a very good relationship with the police. It's not political. It's, these are law enforcement. They want to enforce the law. We're business owners. They want to help downtown business owners. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an ideological thing. It can just be a very practical human thing in terms of getting these laws enforced and having good open lines of communication and mutual respect. And one thing that I noticed that was really effective in Fargo was that the police officer had a good relationship with the protesters themselves, that they felt respected and listened to, and that the police were trying to give them their space to exercise their First Amendment rights, and they were being given clear and fair direction about how to do that, and it made a big difference. I mean, the big thing that I think everybody should be aware of is that the Justice Department doesn't have the back of reproductive health care providers in the current political situation, so people are going to have to look more locally to find solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point, and one that unfortunately we're going to have to stay very mindful of in the months and years to come. So two-part question for you, Lindsay Beyerstein. One is, where can people go to see your film? And secondly, where can people go to get more information on the issues raised by your film?
Both places is rewire.news. So that's rewire.news, and you can just Google Care and Chaos and Rewire, and it should pop right up. It's on our website. And once you're there, you can watch the documentary in full for free. And then Rewire is just a wealth of information about all kinds of reproductive health, reproductive justice, and the law. So yeah, once you're there, please take a look around and gorge yourself on our evidence-based information.
All right, well, we certainly encourage that. And are you working on anything fun or interesting you can talk, perhaps fun is not the right word, that we can talk about before we let you go?
Well, this is a very preliminary idea that I'm for the next movie, which is talking about the collateral damage of people who are chronic pain patients who are being taken off their medication because of anti-opioid hysteria.
Well, that's interesting, and we will be looking forward to seeing what you come up with. And as always, great to talk to you, Lindsay Beyerstein, investigative journalist, broadcaster, and co-director of the new film Care in Chaos at rewire.news. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.